Hello, and welcome to Activ Doctors Online's February webinar. We've all heard a similar story. A tired old man dies weeks or even days after the death of his beloved wife, too lonely and too sad to go on. They say that he lost his will to live and died of a broken heart. That story may be fiction, but the message is fact. You can die of a broken heart. It's called broken heart syndrome, and though it sounds Shakespearean, it's very real. Joining us today is Clinical Assistant Professor from Georgetown University and Activ Doctors Online's Medical Director, Dr. Howard Zahalsky. Dr. Zahalsky, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. So on the next slide, we're going to see what we're talking about today. We're going to start by talking about broken heart syndrome. The title of the section is Don't Break My Heart. We're going to talk a little bit about unusual conditions that you might associate with Valentine's Day. Now, we're not talking about the Valentine's Day that's associated with chocolate and flowers. We're talking about a much worse Valentine's Day. The Valentine's Day that's associated with your significant other breaking up with you 2 days before Valentine's Day. You feel miserable. Well, there's actually a condition called broken heart syndrome, as well as a couple of other conditions that we'll talk about a little bit going forward that are also associated with broken hearts. So for broken heart syndrome, this is actually a condition associated with grief or sadness. It has a much more medical name called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. Takotsubo is a Japanese word for a certain Japanese pot, and we'll see going forward why that's actually relevant. But the point of this, you can actually die of a broken heart. And on the next slide, we'll see why. So here you see a sad woman, although this just could as easily have been a sad man. Men can get broken heart syndrome as well. When you see someone like this, you may think to yourself, wow, that's a sad person, but ultimately you say they just have to get over it. We see depression and sadness sometimes even as mental weakness, but it's really much more than that. All of our thoughts, all of our emotions are regulated by chemicals in our brain. When someone's sad, there are definite measurable changes in levels of chemicals such as serotonin and norepinephrine. That's why when some people actually get clinical depression, we can give them medicines with names like Prozac and Zoloft, which adjust the levels of this serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, and other chemicals in the brain that allow the nerves from one part of the brain to talk with the nerves of another part of the brain. By adjusting levels of these chemicals, you can make someone happier, you can make somebody calmer. But these chemicals that the nerves use to talk, they're not only isolated to the brain. They can be elsewhere in the body, and they can cause a lot of changes elsewhere in the body as well. For instance, under times of significant stress, levels of norepinephrine and serotonin can go up, and this can cause raises in your blood pressure, raises in your heart rate, raises in how much your heart squeezes. Now, in the past, and over the course of evolution, these changes were actually healthy. They kept us alive. For instance, what used to be considered great stress might have been being chased by a lion. When you're being chased by a lion, you want your blood pressure to go up. You want your heart to pump harder because it will help you run faster and climb faster and get away from the lion. Well, nowadays, in our more modern society, the most stressful thing that might happen to a person in a year is not getting eaten by a lion, but rather maybe breaking up with your significant other. Yet the stress chemicals are still the same. You still see bursts of changes in serotonin levels, of norepinephrine levels, and raises in blood pressure, pulse, and how hard your heart squeezes. And these can have dire consequences to people in some cases. Let's go on to the next slide. Sometimes the body can overdo it. Sometimes in an effort to respond to these chemicals released by stress, your body actually can do damage to its own heart. And in fact, it can be very difficult for doctors even to tell the difference from a traditional heart attack and broken heart syndrome, or Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. I'm not going to say Takotsubo cardiomyopathy anymore because it's hard for even me to pronounce it. We'll stick with broken heart syndrome. But when you show up in the emergency room with symptoms such as chest pain and shortness of breath, which can associate with broken heart syndrome, the doctor may and frequently does think that you actually are having a heart attack. Your EKG will look like you're having a heart attack. Even blood tests, which are designed to detect if you're having a heart attack, can read positive initially. But we've been able to discover some key differences between a regular heart attack, which is associated with clots in blood vessels, and broken heart syndrome. And we'll start to see what they are on the next slide. So before we go any further, I'm going to have to do a little bit of cardiac anatomy. Let's look at the normal heart on the far left. You can see that there's a red section shaded as the left ventricle. The first question you might say is, why is that the left ventricle? It's on the right side of the picture. Well, when doctors look at pictures, we always look as if we're looking at someone facing us. So what is on our right side or on the right side of the picture is actually their left side. You can see there are some lighter shaded areas as well. And if you look at the red area and the three lighter shaded areas, if you use your imagination a little bit, you might see what looks like two ice cream cones. The left ventricle is the bottom of one ice cream cone. Then there was a lighter area above it, which is the left atrium. And then on the left side of the picture, you will see a lighter area that is the right ventricle with some ice cream on top, which is the right atrium. That's what a normal heart looks like. The ventricles are roughly V-shaped or shaped like a cone. They fill up with blood, and the left ventricle, which is responsible for pumping most of the blood to your body, squeezes and squeezes the blood to the rest of the body. Well, in broken heart syndrome, the left ventricle gets too stretched out. And as you can see from the picture next to it, it roughly takes on the shape of a Japanese octopus trap, also known as, I bet you've guessed it, a takatsubo. When the ventricle is stretched out, it doesn't squeeze as well. And I'm going to give you an analogy. Imagine you're trying to hold something in your hand, and someone's trying to pull it out of your hand. If it's, for instance, a golf ball that you can really wrap your hands around, it's going to be hard for almost anyone to pull that golf ball out of your hand. You can grip it really, really well because you can wrap all the way around it. But now imagine you're holding a softball, which is bigger, or even a football, which is much bigger. Unless you have giant hands like Aaron Rodgers, it's going to be much easier if you're just holding it in your outstretched hand to keep a really tight grip on that football because your hand is more stretched out and can't reach all the way around. That's what's happening with the ventricle in broken heart syndrome. Because it gets stretched out, it can't squeeze as well and can't pump as much blood, and this can result in drops in blood pressure, lower amounts of oxygen-filled blood being pumped to your body, shortness of breath, and in some cases, even death. Let's go on to the next picture. So here you see two pictures from a cardiac catheterization. This is actually a picture being taken by a doctor as they look at someone's heart. The left picture is a normal heart. You can see that the left ventricle, although I showed it in the last slide as being roughly V or cone-shaped, is actually pretty oval there. But on the right side, you can see the takatsubo-shaped left ventricle, where it's big and stretched out at the bottom, but actually cinched tighter at the top. It almost looks as if someone put a shoelace around the upper left portion of that ventricle. Because of that, not only is it more stretched out at the bottom, but because it remains tighter at the top in that takatsubo shape, the bottom is not able to squeeze the blood out of the heart. The heart gets trapped, the blood gets trapped in the heart, and this is what results in many of the problems seen with broken heart syndrome. Let's go on to the next slide. Your heart doesn't hold its shape by accident. Inside your heart, you actually have these little spider web tendons that hold it in shape. It's believed that in broken heart syndrome, when you have all of those stress chemicals attacking the heart from the nervous system, that sometimes some of these tendons can weaken or even break. That's why some of the blood tests associated with broken heart syndrome can mimic a heart attack. You're actually breaking little microscopic parts of your heart, these little tendons that are helping the heart hold its shape, and that's why part of the heart appears to be stretched out. Now, fortunately, these tend to heal up. So in broken heart syndrome, if you get the person through the acute episode, which can be done with certain medicines, with oxygen, with medicines that take extra fluid out of the heart, and allow them the time to rest, a lot of times broken heart syndrome will heal and you can completely recover, at least as long as you recover from the broken heart itself. Now, there's a subset of what might be considered broken heart syndrome, which can be a little bit more serious, and we're going to see that on the next slide. This slide shows something similar to broken heart syndrome, but a little bit different. It's called Prinzmetal angina. Oh my God, Dr. Zahalsky, I just learned to pronounce Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. Now you're throwing me at Prinzmetal angina. What is that? Well, your heart does not get blood. Your heart needs its own blood. Your heart is a muscle and needs oxygen to flow to the heart. Now you would think that the heart, which has all this blood pumping through it, would be able to just grab some of that blood and use it to keep itself healthy, but that's actually not the case. The blood that the heart pumps is useless as far as the heart is concerned. It's just work. It's kind of like, imagine you work in a snack cake factory. You don't get to just grab a snack cake now and then off the conveyor belt. You have to go at lunchtime and get the lunch that you packed for yourself and eat it. Same thing for the heart. The heart has its own blood vessels that flow to the heart after the blood has been pumped out of the heart that keep the heart happy, healthy, and fed with oxygen. However, under times of stress, one of the things that happens, in addition to your heart rate going up, in addition to blood pressure going up, is sometimes the blood vessels themselves can spasm. I bet a lot of you out there have had back spasms where all of a sudden your back tightened up, or maybe even twitches in your thumb or your eyelid or different parts of your body where muscles will twitch. Well, blood vessels have muscles in their walls that, especially under times of stress, can twitch too. And as you can see on the right side of this slide, when they twitch, they can close off essential blood vessels, especially the blood vessels of the heart. This can actually cause real heart attacks, because if the blood supply to the heart gets cut off, it's similar to getting a clot or a blockage in one of these blood vessels, which is the real cause of traditional heart attacks. So sometimes you can have severe stress, broken heart syndrome, and you can feel chest pain, and it turns out it's not the real Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. You don't get the rupture of those tendons inside your heart. You don't get changes in the shape of your heart. What's happening is that the blood vessels that go to your heart are just spasming, cutting off circulation, actually causing a different kind of heart attack. And yes, it can be very, very difficult to tell the difference between Prinzmetal angina, a real heart attack, and broken heart syndrome of Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. Let's go on to the next slide. So heart disease due to stress, whether it be broken heart syndrome, Prinzmetal angina, or real heart attacks, is not the only thing that can cause your heart to have a problem, especially under times of stress. We're going to start the next section by saying, take another little piece of my heart. Or a better way I like to think about it is, some people after they break up say, they feel like there's a hole in my heart. Well, don't joke about that. That can actually be a serious thing, as we're going to see on the next slide. There are actually 3 specific conditions that are associated with a real hole in your heart. Now, I want you to remember back to that anatomy lesson I gave you with the pictures of the heart. When you have a hole in your heart, blood that doesn't have oxygen mixes with blood that does have oxygen. Have you ever wondered why there's a left and right side of your heart? Well, the right side of your heart, the right atrium and the right ventricle, pump blood to your lungs. The lungs then give oxygen to your blood, and then the left atrium and left ventricle pump it to the rest of your body. Those two sides are not supposed to meet. And on the next slide, we will see why. Now remember, the atria are much smaller than the ventricles. In fact, the atria don't really do a whole lot. They're more like holding areas for the ventricles. The atria hold the blood, it flows into the ventricles pump it. The right ventricle pumps it to the lungs, and then the left ventricle pumps it to the rest of the body. Here you see that the blood without oxygen in it, because the oxygen has all been used up by your body, is blue. And the blood that now has oxygen that has gone through the lungs is in the left atria and the left ventricle, and it's red. But in this person has an atrial septal defect. It's something that is usually a birth defect, but can go years and years without being noticed because sometimes the symptoms of it are very subtle. But what happens is a little blood that has no oxygen in it creeps over onto the side that all of the blood's supposed to have oxygen. Now, why is this so bad? If most of the blood has oxygen, isn't this good enough? And I want you to think about this analogy. I can say this because this actually happened to my cousin. Imagine that you have a wedding dress that is bright white, but someone with some sticky hands, because they were eating a candy, touches the wedding dress, and now there's a little sticky spot on the dress. You want to wash that with very clean water. You go to the tap, you turn on the tap, you make sure the water's running, you get a little on a white napkin, and you dab at the dress so that you don't have a sticky spot on your dress. Well, what happens if someone spills red wine on your dress? Well, you're going to have a very unhappy bride, let me tell you. Now imagine, how much red wine do you think is it safe to mix with that water before the bride gets unhappy? The correct answer is probably 0. But now let's think about it. If you had a barrel with 50 gallons of water and you put 1 drop of red wine into that barrel, do you think anyone would notice if you used that water to clean the white dress? Probably not. On the other hand, if you had just a cup of water and you put even a drop of red wine in it, it's probably going to be enough to discolor the water just enough that when the bride uses it to clean her white dress, you're going to notice that there's some reddish discoloration on the dress, and you're going to have a very unhappy bride. So even a very little bit of red wine mixed in with a good amount of water is still going to be enough to discolor the water enough to make the bride unhappy. Well, think of that bride as your body. Your body wants fully clean, full of oxygen blood. And mixing even a little bit of blood that doesn't have oxygen into a lot of blood that does have oxygen makes your body suffer. Your body can't essentially breathe as well as it would like. And so people with atrial septal defects don't get fully oxygenated blood, and their endurance is lower, their ability to climb stairs is lower, their athletic ability is lower. So you may think of that as just, oh, a weak, non-athletic kid, and then years later you find out that really what's happening is that their oxygenated blood and their blood without oxygen are getting mixed up in their heart. Fortunately, this is a condition that's relatively easily curable by putting a patch using just a catheterization tube, essentially a scope. You go into the heart, you put a patch, and it's usually completely sealed. Now, there are bigger holes in your heart that you can have as well. And let's go on to the next slide. Here we have a ventricular septal defect. These are a bigger deal. They're holes between the two bigger parts of your heart. Why is this a bigger deal? Well, because the ventricles are the part that actually pump the blood, Usually more blood gets mixed up when the hole is in the ventricle. Also, ventricular septal defects tend to be larger. Again, as the slide says, it's most often a birth defect and usually gets noticed pretty early because it usually has serious consequences when too much oxygen and non-oxygenated blood get mixed up. But sometimes after a heart attack, the heart attack can actually cause scarring and a hole to form between the two ventricles, leading to a ventricular septal defect. There's two reasons why the ventricular septal defect, or this kind of hole in your heart, is bad. One is, obviously, that the oxygen gets mixed up, as we talked about. But the other is the left ventricle is the strongest pumping part of your heart. So now the ventricle, which is supposed to pump all of its blood to your body, starts pumping blood the wrong direction. It starts to pump the blood back into the right ventricle because it's stronger than the right ventricle. So now the blood that's supposed to be circulating around your body instead is kind of going back to the starting line. Imagine waiting online for Space Mountain at Disney World, and then 1 out of 3 people who gets to the front of the line is told to go all the way back to the back of the line. Number one, it's going to make the line a lot longer because all of a sudden 1/3 of the people are waiting in line 2 or 3 times. It's also going to make everyone online very unhappy. So in situations like this, the body becomes very unhappy because A, the blood that's getting pumped doesn't have enough oxygen, and B, not enough blood is even being pumped because some of the blood is going in the wrong direction. Let's go to the next slide. The final hole that people can have in their heart is what's called a patent ductus arteriosus. What is a patent ductus arteriosus? Well, it's not actually a hole in the heart so much as a hole right near the heart. But it kind of goes along with the atrial and ventricular septal defects. Before we're born, our heart is not supposed to do very much. Our lungs are supposed to do nothing. Obviously, when you're inside your mom, you're not breathing. You're wrapped in amniotic fluid. All of the oxygen is coming in through the mother and through the placenta. So your body decides that, you know what, we can just bypass those lungs and creates what's called a shunt so that the blood that the right ventricle is pumping to the lungs doesn't bother to go through the lungs, just goes straight to the rest of the body, called this ductus arteriosus. In the moments after you are born, your body releases chemicals that cause the ductus arteriosus to shrivel and disappear. So this shunt that was causing the blood to shift right past the lungs just disappears. But in some people, a very small percentage, it doesn't shut properly. And all of a sudden, you have blood that's going from your right ventricle, and instead of going to your lungs like it should, it just goes straight to your body. Well, we already said that blood without oxygen going to the rest of your body is a very, very bad thing, can make you feel very short of breath. And babies who are born with a patent ductus arteriosus get very sick very quickly, start to turn blue because their body is not pumping the blood to the lungs like it should be. It's pumping the blood without oxygen straight to the rest of the body, expecting the mother, to whom they are no longer connected to be doing all the work to put the oxygen in the blood. So usually pediatricians notice this shortly after birth, and usually emergency surgery is necessary to tie off the patent ductus arteriosus. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So your loved one has broken your heart. Your loved one has left a hole in your heart by their rude and break-up behavior. What are you going to do to react to it? You're going to harden your heart. And there's a medical equivalent for that as well, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Now, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy can actually mean several things, but the one that I'm going to focus on today is where your heart actually literally becomes harder. And the main way that this happens is a condition called amyloid that we're going to see on the next slide. So this is a picture of a heart that has become crusted over and hard. As you can guess, a heart that is hard and crusty is not going to squeeze well, and even more important than not squeezing well is not relaxing well. When you pump, let's say you're pumping up a bicycle tire, while it's very important that you push down to push the air in, it's then also important that you pull the pump all the way back up to fill the pump chamber with more air. If you push down but then only pull up a little bit, each time you pump, you're only going to be pumping a little bit of air. The heart works the same way. The heart has to fully relax in between pumps so that it can fill up with blood to pump again. But in conditions such as hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, especially associated with amyloid, your body loses that ability to relax. As a result, it can't fill up with blood between each pump, and when it tries to pump, it pumps much less blood. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, I try to avoid including too many what might be considered gross anatomical slides, but I really couldn't find anything that would properly show what we're looking at with amyloid besides for this one. So my apologies if this is a little bit strange to look at. On the left side of this slide is the right atrium. Again, right on the left, left on the right. And you can see that the wall of the right atrium, it kind of has a darker red color. It's kind of glossy. It kind of looks like you could squeeze, spongy, like you could squeeze it and it would be soft. Well, on the right side, the left ventricle has been, I will say, ruined by amyloid. It's more of a light pink color. If it was a steak, you would say it might be a little bit overcooked. It's way too thick. The little hole in the center, that black area, which should be filling with blood, has become way too small. And this is because there's a chemical called amyloid that is building up in the walls of the heart. Amyloidosis can be associated with certain medical conditions. In particular, there's one called myeloma, which is a blood disorder that can result in amyloid. And even in scleroderma, you can have amyloid building up in your heart and causing the heart to be just too stiff. A good way to think about this is imagine that bodybuilder who wins the Mr. Universe contest that looks like every muscle in their body is really big and puffy, and now trying to imagine that person tying their shoes. They can't get their big arms over to their feet to tie their shoes. That's what happens here. The muscle has gotten too big, too firm, too stiff, and it can no longer do the simple tasks such as relaxing and pumping blood that it is supposed to do. Let's go to the next slide. So how can Activ Doctors Online help you if you have or are concerned that you could have one of these conditions? Well, I bet you've never heard of most of the conditions we talked about today. It was a fun Valentine's Day topic, but it's a topic that isn't relevant necessarily to most people out there. That's because these conditions are very, very unusual. When you have an unusual condition, you want a doctor who's in the top of their field. If you live in a small town somewhere or an area without a tertiary medical center and you don't know who to turn to, we're the ones you can turn to. With our solutions, we have our personal health records that allow you to keep track of all of the tests. A lot of people with these conditions end up having many unnecessary tests because it's hard to keep track of all the tests that they've been having. Our second medical opinions can put you in touch with one of our experts. We have thousands of experts from the United States and around the world who we can put you in touch with through our second medical opinions and give you an online second opinion so that you will know that you're getting advice from people who are not just the doctors who happen to be available wherever you are, but actually doctors who are in their tops of their field to give their opinions on your situation. And finally, with our e-consultations, if your doctor participates with Activ Doctors Online, we can work to put you in direct contact with them through our video conferencing system so that you can have talks with your doctors without necessarily always having to go into the office. through these solutions, we can work, especially if you have rare and unusual serious diseases, we can work to keep you at the maximum level of health that you could possibly be. Now with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Caitlin, who can give you a little bit more information about signing up for our revolutionary services at Activ Doctors Online.
Thank you, Dr. Zahalsky. Here at Activ Doctors, our vision is to reinvent healthcare by providing user-friendly mobile health solutions that allow people all over the world to live healthier, safer, and more productive lives. We strive to educate, engage, and empower our members to really take control of their health destiny, save time, money, and in some cases, lives. We invite you to try Activ Doctors Online free for 30 days. Simply head over to our website, www.activdoctorsonline.com, and click Get Started on the homepage. If you would like more information about the webinar, would like to schedule a demonstration of our unique health platform, or have any questions about the service, please feel free to contact Dr. Zahalsky or myself directly using contact@activdoctors.com. You can also reach us on social media. Find us on Twitter at Activ Doctors and on Facebook and LinkedIn at Activ Doctors Online. Thank you, and we hope you'll join us next month for another informative health webinar.